Okay, with me right now is Ross Baird. I think more than anything, Ross, you're just a really good friend. So this is actually a really fun conversation for me because we've known each other in various capacities over the years, and it's cool because I've seen you at work and I've seen you at home, and I've seen you in different spheres, and just as a friend, it's really cool to see you as a person and how intertwined who you are is with what you do. And so it's cool to kind of have you on the show today to talk a little bit about the Ross Baird that sometimes is not projected, maybe from a stage, as you talk about the issues and the challenges that we face as a country. So maybe starting off, talk to me a little bit about the Ross that maybe some people don't know, some stories from your upbringing or what shaped the Ross Baird of today.
Bryce, it's great to be here, and I think being your friend first is really meaningful. I grew up in Atlanta, and Bobby Jones, the champion golfer, is Atlanta's native son, and he once said something that really stuck with me. He said, "Friends and friendship are the two most important words in the English language." And I have, what I do day to day is brings me a lot of joy. It is something I feel called to do. It's something I feel very meaningful. It's also exhausting. I do a million different things, and I'm spread very thin some days, and it feels like progress is very hard to make. But I think I have I'm really lucky to have a very good group that's pretty small of very close friends that are probably one of the things I value most about life is the very close friends I have that I experience life with, and you're one of them. So I'm extremely grateful.
Well, I think that's an interesting point because I think in our society there's a lot of statistics around loneliness, and I think one of the things you've done really, really well is nurture friendships. Your just intentionality. Going way back, I was the son of an Army officer, so we moved all the time. So friendship was like this 2-year thing that you did at duty stations. But to watch kind of you develop lifelong friendships with people, even back in high school and before, and still maintain good relationships, I think is not a diminished point in kind of who you are as a person.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate that. I mean, if I think about growing up, I think of the people. I can point to people who came into my life at certain points who very clearly changed the trajectory of my life. I grew up in Atlanta, and if you are familiar with Atlanta, grew up in North Atlanta in a very comfortable upbringing, and I spend most of my time today in neighborhoods that do not look like the neighborhood I grew up in, and I think about the church I went to growing up. The youth pastor is a guy named Michael Poulos. He's still a pastor today in North Carolina. And Michael ran a ministry that took a lot of kids who grew up in a pretty comfortable part of Atlanta, and we spent a lot of time out on the streets, spending weekend nights in a downtown shelter, working the overnight shift. We would do church exchange trips to Washington, D.C. or Seattle, Washington with churches that our church had a relationship with, and we spent a week in a not very nice part of that town getting out and about. And so as I think about the trajectory of my life and the things that you notice and you care about, the friends I made through that youth experience and the people that I looked up to and modeled myself after. I mean, my oldest friend in the world, his name is Robbie. He lives in New York today, works in media. We met when we were 4. He was in the same church youth group as I was. We probably communicate 3 times a week, text, talk.
4 years old.
Yeah. But we went through these formative experiences together and became very, very good friends. And so it's
So talk to me a little bit about some of those formative experiences. What if you could pick a couple or even just one where that are kind of stuck in your brain that have been, you mentioned this youth pastor, so that seems rather formative. Are there a couple of others that you think have really shaped you over the last 20, 30 years?
Yeah, so I mentioned our church every summer, and I would look for it as favorite week of the year. We would do these exchange trips to other parts of the country, and there was a church in D.C. that our pastor had a relationship with, and we'd go and we'd stay in the church basement and work in different whatever things around D.C. And there was this guy who ran this breakfast soup kitchen ministry. His name was Ishmael, and he was hilarious, and he was extremely well organized, and I loved him. Like, I wanted to be on his team. Like, we split up into shifts. And then one evening at dinner, we were at a different soup kitchen in a different part of the city, and like people coming down the line to get, and Ishmael was in the soup kitchen. And it turned out, like, I was like, you are my idol, and like, you are a recipient of food. What's going on? And I sat with him at dinner. I was talking to him, and it turns out he was part-time, making minimum wage, like stayed in one shelter because it was all he could afford. But he spent 10 hours a week as the lead volunteer manager at another shelter. And I was kind of like, if you live in a homeless shelter, you like shouldn't have to work in another one. And he was like, I have more than the next guy. I've got a job. I've got a roof over my head. Like, why wouldn't I? I'm extremely lucky. And I just, I think that the point of, I think that there's a real power dynamic in how money works in society that's extremely destructive. And we talk about two pocket thinking versus one pocket thinking. I think, one direction that conversation with Ishmael went about is like, look, I live in a comfortable family. I'm in high school. I'm almost definitely going to go to a good college and get a good job. I owe something to society, so I'm here volunteering. This is a guy who is a recipient of my charity. Like, I should serve him. Why is it the other way around? And in his mind, he was in a tough position in life, but he was also in a position of privilege over other people, and that he had 10 hours a week to volunteer and give. And so he did. And so the idea of, some people are winners and they should take care of the losers, and other people are losers and like they should be lucky for what they received. It's just totally turned on the head. So I think a lot of the thinking of, what do we do with our lives and who is in power over whom, that just, I still remember that was probably 20 years ago. I still remember it like
that's
it was
really
yesterday.
cool. Well, and I think what I've known about you over the last decade is just kind of watching you and learning from you. So I think, founder, CEO for a long time of Village Capital Investments. So both the nonprofit and the fund, founder of Capital Access Labs, a new initiative between Rockefeller and Kauffman Foundations, and working now on a strategy for opportunity zones. There's obviously some threads there, but it's a really powerful story that I think you have carried forward ever since university, and maybe before that. But what would you say, if you could point to a couple of things, what is the purpose? Like, what is the driver for Ross Baird to get involved? I mean, you could do anything. You went to a top tier college. You had an unbelievable graduate program. You're exceptionally smart. You're well connected. Why are you pouring yourself into these things with such a vigor and such a deep passion?
So my favorite class in college is a course called History of the American Revolution, taught by a guy named Stephen Innes, who sadly passed away while I was in college, but he was incredibly important to me. And his whole thesis was America, pre-colonial America, New England, had the highest literacy rate adjusted for its time of any society and country. It was the most equal society and adjusted for any time and country. And he said that the strength of Puritan New England was in its civic associations and its community. He said it was a society that was brought together by churches, schools, militia, town meetings, the pub. Like it was a very thick social fabric. And so he said, he was talking about Paul Revere's ride, and he's like, the story of Paul Revere is all wrong. You have this philosophy that Paul Revere is a hero, and he did
this lone rider.
Yeah, he said the thing was the way that they had organized. It's kind of like a telephone tree. The way that they had organized it. If Paul Revere were captured, there would have been 10 other men who would have jumped in and ridden. And it was the society that created Paul Revere, not Paul Revere who did something exceptional, but the society itself was exceptional. Of course, there are all kinds of gender and race issues in 1780s New England, but this idea of friendship and community being stronger than the individual is probably the one through line. So, thinking about Village Capital, the idea of the hero entrepreneur, the Travis Kalanick, Steve Jobs, like this one person who just does things. The whole point of Village Capital is entrepreneurs in community with each other can make a bigger dent in problems than by themselves. The idea of Blueprint Local now saying it's not going to be a startup or a big housing development or a ribbon cutting of a big announceable or a Amazon putting their headquarters. It's not going to be that strongman. It's going to be thousands of different projects that are all rowing in the same direction that's going to make a distressed part of Louisville or Baltimore resilient and proud. That's the big through line. It is more exhausting and more rewarding to go down that path. But it's ultimately more rewarding. And if you think of, I feel very lucky to live in the country we do and in the society we do. And it has been a lot of people over the years for different motivations. Sometimes it's faith, sometimes it's code of ethics, sometimes it's just practical, who have put something greater ahead of themselves. I do worry that is being lost very rapidly. And I think preserving that is really the only hope we have as a society.
That's a really good point. So you're not a spring chicken anymore. You're getting up in years.
Younger than you are.
Younger than me.
Yeah.
Where I'm going with it is you've had some unbelievable experiences that have shaped you. Mm-hmm. And I think as I talk to young people and as you've taught young people at UVA or other places, what are some things you would encourage the younger generation to do in discovering kind of what you've been able to discover and fortunate to discover as it relates to kind of purpose and work, meaning and society and friendship? Like, are there some experiences or some opportunities that you would put before people to throw themselves at?
Yeah. Our own experiences really kind of are all we have to draw from. So I don't know that I could tell you what I would tell myself 10 to 15 years.
Let's do that.
I think that, we've been through a lot. There have been times that have been wonderful and joy-filled, and there were times that have been extremely successful, and there have been some dark times. And I think that going back to what I said, like prioritizing for relationships and the community that you're building over kind of what needs to happen that day is a constant struggle, especially if you want to be effective and accomplish something, because you can't, like, there are lots of people who are extremely happy and care 0% about what they do in their work. And that's actually fine. That's actually, like, people find meaning in all different ways. Mm-hmm. But I am a person who will always find meaning in my work, and it is important for me, for my work to be successful. And sometimes to be successful, you have to make hard and difficult decisions, and sometimes to be successful, you get so wrapped up in it. But prioritizing for relationships over deliverables is one very important thing. I think understanding what that North Star is for you, both personally and professionally, is important too. So, for example, I feel very very grateful to have built Village Capital with some really wonderful colleagues over time. I think one of the things towards the end of transitioning out of Village Capital that I recognize is one, I feel at my best when I am building. I think building something from 0 to 60 miles an hour is a very different skill set than driving on the interstate at 60 miles an hour and not crashing. Both are incredibly important. I think the latter is less my skill set. The former is much more mine. Recognizing that's important. And also knowing when you really need to take over versus let others take over is really important. So I think what we are doing with Blueprint Local, going deeper into a few communities versus having a very large portfolio, much more is what brings me joy. Developing these different theses from scratch and building teams that can run it is very much in my wheelhouse. So I would say prioritize relationships. If you care about what you do professionally, own it, and figure out what you are very good at. And then I think the final thing is, it's very, very difficult to convince other people to do something they don't want to do. And I think part of leadership is recognizing what other people are good at and optimizing for that versus saying, why aren't you doing this thing that we need to get done? So Kobe Bryant just passed away, and I was Kobe Bryant's favorite book, from what I heard, was a book that Bill Russell wrote. And there was a piece in that book of how Bill Russell won 11 titles. And there's a piece of that book where Bill Russell saw that his teammate, John Havlicek, also a Hall of Famer, was much better, I forget the exact specifics, it was like he was much better at leading a fast break from the left side of the court than the right side of the court. And I have been here. Bill Russell's like, for years, he was like, for goodness sakes, can't you like do a fast break on the other side of the court? Sometimes the ball's over here, sometimes the ball's over there. And then he realized, that's not honoring John's strength. And what he did is he practiced when he was going up for rebounds, landing his feet in a position so as often as possible he was facing the left side of the court. He's like, I realized it was within John to learn how to get on the right side of the court, but it's also within me to learn how to pass to the left side of the court. And that's much more in my control. So I think, having a sense of what's in your control and what's not is a lesson that's been hard for me, and it's still hard every day, but I think every day I get a little bit better.
Those are really good. And I think, man, just knowing you. So as you're talking, I'm reminded of just these memories of my own in interaction with you. Like one of them I know was at a SOCAP several years ago. You're super busy, but because you prioritize friendship, you're very into like, hey, let's get 30 minutes. It's all the time we had, but like let's just get 30 minutes. We're going to step aside from what's going on. We're just going to connect. And I think, in a practical way to kind of punctuate what you said, I think that's an important thing that oftentimes we miss. We get really busy. And I think what you've been able to do and be effective at doing is prioritizing those friendships, which leads to some of the Blueprint stuff. Cause it's really interesting that literally a couple of years ago, over drinks as friends, you, me, and Graham talking about what could be done at scale across the country to mobilize capital to places that are underserved, underestimated. And it's cool to see where Blueprint Local is today as a strategy to do that. So talk to us a little bit about what you're working on with Blueprint, what you're excited about with Blueprint, and then we'll get into some of the challenges after that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most meaningful experiences for me has been working with you and Access Ventures on the investment in Shelby Park, which we called the Street Corner investment, and it really made a lot of sense to me hearing you and the team's vision of, we are here, this is where we work, we're going to invest across all types of products, housing and commercial real estate and growing businesses, and we're going to invest in the arts right here where we are. That I had not thought of it that way, and it made a lot of sense to me. And I think working with you on that and the path of saying, if we can do it here, we can only control what we can control to go. But if we can do this in a neighborhood where we are spending a lot of time, why couldn't it be done other places? And I think, to think big, you have to think small. One of the things that I know we've talked about is in the Christian tradition, there is in the Bible, Jesus has a promise to be king of the world. And people thought that meant one conception, which going back to the power of it, I'm going to be the emperor of Rome. I'm going to rule over everyone. And what Jesus actually has never really left about a 30-mile radius. And I think part of that is intentional to say, like, here is what taking care of your community looks like. And so he then trains up and sends out apostles to say, you can do, if I can do this, you can do this. And so I think when people say scale, it means be as big as possible. It's actually, if you can do very meaningful work in a 10-block radius, you can do it in many 10-block radiuses. And so part of the thought of Blueprint Local is I do think the size of Wall Street and the size of Silicon Valley and the size of government programs have just given people a lot of despair, because it's just the way money moves in the world is completely inaccessible. So the thought of being hyper local and how we think thoughtfully and investing in a neighborhood, it's just, it connects with a lot of threads that are meaningful in my life. Yeah.
And so if I could, what are some of the challenges? So you've been at this with Blueprint now for a couple of years, in initial conception, mobilizing partners, been a part of kind of trying to shape some of even the policy even. What are some of the challenges you see as you press into the kind of the next stage of this community vision that you have?
I mean, to me, it's not new or different. I mean, I think if we were in New England in 1771 and said, "Here's what we're trying to be," people would be like, "Of course." Right? I mean, or the Northwest Ordinance, the very first law that our Congress passed after the Constitution, said two things. It said people will move to these states and people will have no more than 40 acres and slavery will not be allowed. So it was like, people will be property owners and everyone will be free. Like these are foundational principles that have gone away. But I think that there are a lot of entrenched interests with where the system is that either fear change, and in many cases rightfully so, because change has usually meant bad things for a lot of communities where there's a lot of institutional discrimination, or don't really have any incentive to change. It's like, things are pretty good for me. Why would I change it? So to say we're moving from a big dominated world to a small dominated world, people who control power and money are pretty big in it. So it's like, why would I do anything different?
Yeah. So, with opportunity zones, there's a lot of critics, because it's still relatively new. And like you just said, people fear what they don't know. And what do you say to some of those critics, especially because it's not unfounded? You've got a lot of hurt that's been done, a lot of harm that's been done to communities, disinvested communities of color historically over the years. And it's perceived as yet one more program who at the end of the day, it's going to lead to wealth extraction versus wealth creation, if I could borrow your phrase. But I think it's an important piece, and I think it's also distinctive between what I see as an imperative of Blueprint and what I see in some of it. So how do you balance, and how do you answer those questions to critics?
I think there are two answers. I think one, anyone doing business with a community that has been disadvantaged has to meet a high bar of ethical behavior. I think the intentionality of what you are trying to do and the sensitivity to what the outcomes are has to be very high. And so I would say criticism of, capitalism has been incredibly parasitic in poor neighborhoods, from dollar stores to check cashers to, people buying up and moving people. Like, there have been a lot of bad actors. So I'd say A, criticism is justified, but B, the status quo isn't working. There are I have spent a huge part of my career in neighborhoods where if we change nothing, it's only getting worse. And I think fear is very natural. People have and look at our politics, people have a very good sense of what they are against. People do not have a good sense of what they are for. So if we were to say, go in and build 400 units of housing and 100% are affordable at, let's call it 100 to 100% area median income. People would say that's gentrification. You're building nice housing in this poor neighborhood. People in poor neighborhoods deserve great housing. People in poor neighborhoods deserve grocery stores. People in poor neighborhoods deserve jobs, and it will take change to get there. So, but I think people say we don't want change, ... Therefore, all change is bad, which is totally understandable. But if you say, here is what great housing means, here is what we are for, here is what we are trying to accomplish that is a productive way. I think you look at people's opinions of political parties, people's opinion. I mean, the modern church is very defined by what it's against, and you see church membership at an all-time low, which is, if all you hear from church is we don't like these people or we don't like those people, that especially if you are in a person in that category, I understand. So I think it is easy, but intellectually lazy to say, here's what we're against. And it's very hard to say, here's what we're for.
And so with impact investing, you and I have talked about this before. There's a video, I think, several years ago, which I think fits in with the stuff around Blueprint and Village Capital and all the work that you've done around disinvested communities. What do you think it's going to take for this to move into the mainstream, to become a need to have versus this nice to have? What are the hurdles that we as a society still, because the data is there. I mean, the data shows that they outperform. The data shows that this provides greater flexibility and opportunity for people to have economic mobility. What are the hurdles that you think we still have yet to overcome?
I think people have a very messed up relationship with money. I think it's people don't understand. The average person doesn't understand what their money is doing in the world. If you go to X university, you have no idea. You might hate gentrification, displacement, but you might have no idea that your university's endowment is invested in private equity funds that are doing that. You might care a lot about climate, but a lot of your retirement account might be invested in companies that have a horrible record on climate, and you don't know that. But I think people also want safe and secure retirements. People want low tuition at universities. People want things that money delivers. And so I think people are incentivized not to ask questions. And so there's a kind of transparency and fear. I think the reason why we talk about one pocket all the time is I think there's only so much we can control. We can control what we do with our money, and we can control what we do with our time. And if we ask hard questions, and it's extremely uncomfortable around my time, my career, my job, am I doing something that is meaningful to me and reflect my values? A lot of people say yes, a lot of people say no. But a lot of people don't ask the question. Or is my money or the money of the institutions that have a meaningful interaction with my life, is that backing up? Until people ask that question as intentionally as they ask the question of, I don't know. I mean, people all the time would say, there are behavior changes that are slow, fast. Like in the 60s, when the idea of seatbelts came about, like nobody wears seatbelts. But today, like if I took your daughter in my car and I said, "Oh, she doesn't need to wear a seatbelt," you say, "Are you crazy?" My hope is like if I go to X university and I say, I care a lot about climate, is the endowment managed an XYZ company, they'd say, yeah, but it's making us lots of money. Like there's a behavior change. It's like, are you crazy? It's not worth it. And so until people, like, we're so disconnected in and I think people have forgotten that they have power over their time and their money because it's so disconnected, in a lot of cases opaque. And I think in a lot of times, and it's intentionally opaque, but everyone has agency to ask questions around what's my money doing, what's my time doing.
Yeah. So 10, 20 years in the future, you're working really hard at Blueprint and trying to figure out, I think, a thoughtful and intentional deployment that achieves the intent of that legislation. Give me a picture of what those communities look like in your mind. If we're able to do this thing that we are aspiring to do, to coordinate capital and to serve these communities, what does that look like 10, 20 years from now?
I think that people in the communities feel free to pursue what they want to. I think that if I want to start a business today, I'm like, A, I don't have the safety net to do it. B, I don't have the access to capital to do it. C, if I have an idea for I don't know, X business, how could I possibly get the storefront to do it? The market is not free at all. It's highly constrained. If I were to say, hey, I'd love to be a teacher, I'd be like, but I also want to live in the city that I grew up in, and how can teachers afford that? I mean, I would say that it comes down to two things. So one, kind of individual freedom to choose what you value and do what you value. And two, I think people feel connected to something bigger than themselves. And I think about the communities where people do feel pride in, or the things that people feel pride in. People feel pride in sports teams because it represents something bigger than you. People feel pride. I think there's a book by Robert Putnam called Our Kids, and it traces a very simple thing. Like he said 30 years ago, when people said our kids, they meant our kids of the neighborhood, like our kids going to go to good schools. And today when people say our kids, they talk about me and my wife's kids. And so it's like, do people feel ownership over a community's kids in future versus I'm getting mine? And because I feel like there's not enough to go around. So I think mindset of scarcity today goes to mindset of abundance, and we're all going to be okay.